Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Bill Roach, and this is another episode of Timeless Dialogues. And today, we're going to look at Francis Schaeffer's concept of the line of despair. Now, some of you are probably thinking, Francis who? Now, Francis Schaeffer was an individual who was a 20th century evangelical theologian, philosopher, and apologist who equipped the church to think in the concepts of worldview studies. Namely, if you are going to follow a particular worldview, which answers questions like, where did I come from? How shall I live? Who am I? And where am I going? So questions of origins, questions of morality, questions of identity, and questions of sort of final descent, where you're going to go, your conclusion after you die. How you answer those types of questions really affect the way that we live and breathe and move in this world. Now, a lot of people are probably thinking one of two things. For those of you who are familiar with Francis Schaeffer, you're probably thinking, this is old news. We know these things and move on. But here's what I found. The vast majority of people today have not read Francis Schaeffer. The vast majority of people today haven't even really heard of Francis Schaeffer. So the reason that this is important is I want us to, in many ways, re-engage our audience today with this key thinker and this key concept, because what it's going to do is it's going to give you a way to, one, understand the world in which you live, and two, evaluate the ideas that you're constantly being just bombarded with in this world. Now, let me give you the context for my understanding and my interactions with Francis Schaeffer. Back in the 2000s, early 2000s, I was living in downtown Chicago. I was working at a church in Cabrini Green, which Cabrini Green, for those of you who don't know, was basically one of the worst housing projects in the United States. And it was located in downtown Chicago. And I was being bombarded with ideas from all of these different students and all of these different issues that were just coming about because of the proximity that I had to the different universities, the key places of influence within one of our largest cities. And what I found is that I really had no way to actually interpret what was going on, and I really didn't know how to actually engage the ideas that I was facing. So I got done with just doing this internship, and I went back to college, and I had to take my first philosophy class. And I'll be honest, I was incredibly intimidated by the concept of taking philosophy because it seems very abstract. It seems almost like, what's the point of this? How does this actually apply to my real life? And one of the first books that we were asked to read was the book by Francis Schaeffer titled The God Who Is There. And in that book, he helped me to understand that ideas not only have consequences, but they have origin. There are key figures who taught certain things about the big questions of life. Topics relating to metaphysics, what is reality, epistemology, how do we know, how shall we live, which is ethics. But it also gets into issues relating to politics and ultimately theology. And when this concept came home to me, it all clicked. In fact, it sort of changed my entire life. And I went on to not only do undergraduate work, but graduate level work, and finally doctoral work in philosophy. So I actually finished a PhD in philosophy of religion with a special emphasis on religious epistemology and philosophy of hermeneutics. Setting all that aside, the point is that it gripped me. It helped me understand the world in which we live, and I want to equip you, this audience, or somebody that's out there looking at this, to understand this basic concept as we look at it. So here's how I want to do this. We'll just go to an evaluation scene, and I want to pull up Schaeffer's line of despair. And what I want you to see here is that he starts off by giving us this idea that there are certain things that are truths that seem to be above reason in society and truths that seem to be in the realm of reason. And society has told us in so many ways that there are certain aspects of reality that we just can't know, or we have to be skeptical about them. And that's really been the influx of skepticism and agnosticism. Now, what I want to do is I actually want to quote Schaeffer here as you're looking at this little chart that he gives us. And this is coming from his complete works, Francis Schaeffer's The Complete Works, A Christian Worldview. And he's actually looking at this very thing that you are here. And he says this, quote, "The line of despair. Thus we have a date lined like this: Europe before 1890 and the United States before 1935. And then he says, here is the line of despair: Europe after 1890 and the US after 1935. Now, here's what I want you to look at here. I want you to think about it in this sense. He says, notice that I call the line of despair. Above the line, we find men living with the romantic notion of absolutes, though with no sufficient logical basis. This side of the line, all is changed. Man thinks differently concerning truth." So have you ever thought about that? That there was a time in which the concept of truth and the notion of absolutes was in many ways granted in society, but then it shifted. And what the shift was the denial of truth, or the redefinition of truth, to be something that's subjective. So Schaeffer used to argue for this concept of we need to have true truth. And by that, he meant truth is that which is absolute, it's universal, it's objective, it's cross-cultural, it's true for all people at all places at all times. But what came about was a new definition of truth, sort of a false truth notion, where truth was now subjective. It was now perspectival. It's something where your senses don't just receive the reality of truth, they determine the notion of truth. Truth is that which is true for you and not for me. It's this notion where it's culturally biased or based, it's racially, or maybe it's gender based, or whatever concept that we want to come up with to make it subjective. Now, notice what he says here. He goes on to say, in order to understand this line of despair more clearly, think of it not as a simple horizontal line, but as a staircase. And he shows how you have this staircase going from philosophy, art, music, general culture, and theology. And he says this: each of these steps represent a certain stage in time. The higher is the earlier, the lower the later. It was in this order that the shift in truth affected men's lives. He goes on to say the shift spread gradually and in three different ways. People did not suddenly wake up one morning and find that it had permeated everywhere at once. So let's look at this. He says, first, all of it spread geographically. The ideas began in Germany and spread outward. They affected the continent first, then crossed the Channel to England, and then the Atlantic to America. Second, it spread through society, from the real intellectual to the more educated, down to the workers, reaching the middle class last of all. And third, it spread as represented in the diagram from one discipline to another, beginning with the philosophers and ending with the theologians. Theology has been last for a long time. It is curious to me, in studying this whole cultural drift, that so many pick up the latest theological fashion and hail it as something new. But in fact, what the new theology is now saying has already been said previously in each of the other disciplines. So let me give you an example. I have a professor who wrote a dissertation on objectivity and biblical interpretation. And when he was defending his dissertation and even working on his dissertation, people kept giving him all these ideas about how our historical horizon affects us to the point that we can't actually have an objective interpretation of the Bible, or our metaphysical conditions affect us so that we can't have an objective interpretation of the Bible or any of reality, or that language is somehow conventional, therefore we can't have cross-cultural notions of meaning that can be objectively understood. And he would always joke and say, okay, I know that you're reading that in your hermeneutics books, but which part of Heidegger, Gadamer, or Wittgenstein do you want me to actually quote who taught those things first? And this is what Schaeffer's talking about. Our ideas are in many ways first based in philosophical thinking. And one of the reasons that people need to actually study philosophy is because a lot of the aberrant views that start to affect theology find their origins in the key ideologies of the philosophers. And you might be thinking, well, why is that? Well, it's because that's what philosophers do. They think about such things, they're dealing with them at a high academic level. And then, as Schaeffer says, it starts in one place, and yet it permeates to different aspects of society. And for him, the whole existentialist movement, or the idealist movement that ultimately brought about, found its origins in Germany. And we're going to trace that here in a minute. But what I want you to see is that it starts to affect everything. And that's why Schaeffer talks about how you don't just have art, you have different eras of art. And today we live in a postmodern age, and you'll go to these different places on university campuses, or you'll go to different cities and you'll just see walls leading to nowhere. You'll see just random things where you think, which engineer built that? But the reality is that what you're seeing is you're seeing a philosophy being reflected in the arts. You're seeing it reflected in the way that people are displaying that which they value and how they organize reality, or how they perceive to organize reality. But it doesn't just stop with the arts. It affects music, and we all have seen big shifts in music. We know that there are different genres of music, but there are also different claims taught in music. Well, where did they come from? They're downstream from one's philosophy, which then starts to permeate into culture and then ultimately into theology. And what's interesting is that Christians used to recognize this kind of thing. They would see that these ideas have origins and that there are real consequences of them, and we tried to study them in order to be aware of them. We wanted to be renewed in the transforming of our minds. But we have found that so much of this has changed, and in many ways we can see that not only do we live in a post-truth era, within the evangelical church, ironically, we're living in a post-Schaeffer era, where people are not actually evaluating their ideas and the real consequences. And I don't want to divulge into it too much, but I think probably one of the things that this whole woke movement has revealed is the fact that many Christians are not thinking in traditional worldview studies. And they're not thinking in the concepts of true truth and the notions of subjectivity and how that actually affects our views of the Bible and our theology, and what that's looking like not only in the broader culture, but in the things that are taught in our churches. You know, we talk about how we're a people that are following the book. We're following the scriptures. But like my former professor used to say, when people would talk about all the different hermeneutical trends, which part of Gadamer, Heidegger, or Wittgenstein do you want me to quote? Or with this, which woke philosopher or economist or whichever do you want me to quote in order to actually show you the origin of your ideas, not just the consequences of your ideas? So his point is that this line of despair and where we're living at sort of in this post-1935 United States is we're living in a time where we're experiencing the death of truth. So what I want to do is I want to illustrate this. And Schaeffer gives us this little graph here. And what he does is he talks about the way that it came about. And he talks about earlier philosophies and later philosophies. Now, probably the fountainhead where we start to see the notion of subjectivity, and in many respects, the early precursor to radical subjectivity, is found in Immanuel Kant, the notion of agnosticism. You don't know reality in and of itself, but only as it appears unto you. And this is what the real notion of transcendental thinking is. It's not, oh, I'm floating up in the clouds and I'm having a transcendental experience of, ineffable mystical concepts, even though that's where it finds its origins. Because if you don't know the ultimate absolute, namely God himself, you just have mystical appropriations of it. Don't think of like Eastern transcendental meditation. Think of it in the concepts of transcendental thinking. We'll break that down at a later time. And then we get to Hegel and the concept of his dialectic. You have a thesis and an antithesis that's always converging into a synthesis. So not only do we not know reality in and of itself, but reality is in constant flux. And we see this come about as a notion of subjectivity. And this is where we find individuals like Soren Kierkegaard and the existential theologians and philosophers are giving us this notion that reality in and of itself is determined by our actions. So traditionally, it's been understood like this. To be is to do. So your nature determines your actions. So dogs are going to do dog things and cats are going to do cat things, but human beings are going to do human being things. Why? Because their nature gives rise to their actions. But existentialism changed all of that. They said instead of to be is to do, rather to do is to be, which is a short form of saying your actions determine your nature. So you would see these existential theologians that would say, well, my essence is the culmination of all of my life experiences coming into a major focal point in the final life experience of death. That would be like Sartre or many of the atheistic theologians and existentialists like this that are giving us these concepts. And what we find is that there are secular forms of existentialism, but there are religious forms of existentialism. And we know the secular forms would be your Sartres and so forth, but your religious forms would be your dialectical theologians, your Kierkegaard, your Barth, your Brunner, and all of the figures that are giving us some of the precursors of issues with, the new hermeneutic and the issues of subjectivity and so on and so forth. But what you have to see is that the religious existentialists are building upon the foundations of philosophical existentialism, which is built upon, in many respects, the evolutionary notions of Hegel's dialectic, which are ultimately based off of Kant's idealistic transcendental method of agnosticism. Now, I know those are a lot of big philosophical terms, but think of it as Schaeffer was saying before. Let's think of it in this regard. In his line of despair, prior to it, you could know reality and absolutes were absolutely true. But on the other side of it, subjectivity took over. Absolutes were not known and reality became in flux. So that philosophy worked out into its art, into the music, into the culture, and into the theology. But the converse of it could be is that you can actually have good philosophies that affect art and music and culture and theology. But let's continue to look at this just a little bit more. There are true religious aspects of this, and we touched upon this where, the philosophy affected a person like Kierkegaard, and flowing from Kierkegaard, you have secular existentialism and you have religious existentialism. And we find these reflected in maybe the hippie art and music and general culture of the 1960s. And Schaeffer traced so much of this, where you're seeing the massive riots at a place like Berkeley, or you're seeing the influx of what that did to the notion of the Vietnam War, or the early precursors of Marcuse and other figures. But what I want to look at is, how does this affect our theology? And what Schaeffer claims is that there is, in many respects, a direct line from Kant to Hegel to Kierkegaard to Barth and into religious existentialism. And what I want us to see here is that when you look at sort of the post-Kantian world, what Kant was giving us was this idea of a non-cognitive, non-propositional form of reality. So in that, the cognitive would be the actual mental basis or the truth value of the things that we claim to know. And the propositional would be how we think about it in propositional terms, or we write about it, or we communicate about it. And what has been argued historically is that Christianity is a cognitive and propositional religion. We can actually have the truth content of God and history and Jesus Christ and our theology and write it in real propositional form. And that's because reality can be known, and ultimate reality, namely God, can be known. But what happened with the advent of Kant is your ultimate reality, God, couldn't be known. He became a non-cognitive sort of feature that's out there that isn't known with the mind. And what happened is that if you can't know it cognitively, you're not able to write it in concepts propositionally. So what this did is not only could we not know God via natural theology and the rationality of the mind, we really couldn't know God through divine special revelation in the Bible either. So we're left with, in many respects, this mythical non-knowledge of God. And the reflections that came about in post-Kantian thinkers were things like this. Well, if God isn't known by reason, maybe he's known through some other avenue, maybe emotions or feelings or mystical experience and the like. But here's where probably the greatest influx is that Kant gave us this notion of religion within the realms of reason. And ultimately, it was a non-special revelation, non-revealed type of religion. And this is what became known as theological liberalism. And this is what was taught from a figure such as Friedrich Schleiermacher, who was the theological bastion of theological liberalism, who worked out in a systematic form Kant's notion of religion within the realms of reason and his notion of theological liberalism, which was a non-cognitive, non-propositional form of religion. So we don't know God via the mind. We know him through some type of existential dependence, mystical concepts. But notice this. We sing this old hymn where it says something like, "Ask me how I know he lives. He lives within my heart," speaking about the resurrection. And that's very much something that Schleiermacher would have taught. You don't know that Jesus Christ rose from the dead by investigating what the scriptures teach or what history may present. You have to have a living experience with Christ in some way, shape, or form, which was always non-cognitive and mystical of some sort. And this is what theological liberalism gave us. But what we find is that these cultural despisers of religion started to hate confessional Christianity and the notion of the Bible as God's revealed word. And this permeated through the higher academies. So think Harvard, Yale, Princeton, and the like. But notice, it started as a philosophy, worked its way into arts and music, into general culture, and it found its way into theology. And this is where we're going to get all of the aberrant views in the liberal stream of theology. So if you wonder where these issues where you're going to see people at Union or Princeton asking for the forgiveness of the plants, or they're always trying to give some kind of lament, well, their origins were in agnosticism. But there were also mediating forms of it. And what we mean by that is that classic Reformed and evangelical thinking was that the notion was full cognitive, full propositional. Liberalism and agnosticism was non-cognitive and non-propositional. Well, existentialism was modified cognitive and modified propositional. And that's where we get these ideas from a figure like Barth that Jesus could both be sinless and yet a sinner. The Bible can be God's word and yet contain errors. And this is what dialectical sort of crisis theology became. And this is what he's talking about here. This is the origins of Barth's notion of religious existentialism. And the idea is that this staircase had its origins in art and music and culture, but ultimately in philosophy. So when we're trying to evaluate the world that we live in today, we have to ask ourselves these questions. Where did this idea come from? And what are the rational consequences of buying into it? And that's kind of been my biggest critique that I've seen with so many evangelicals buying into the woke movement, because ultimately wokeism and critical theory is the death of truth. It's a radical perspectivalism. It's the actual radical application of postmodernism, and we see the consequences. It's led to the destruction of society, to the corruption of the arts, the corruption of music, but now it's affecting theology. And we're seeing it coming into our evangelical institutions, and we once thought that we were inoculated by this because we studied apologetics. We studied figures like Schaeffer, but unfortunately, people are asking, Francis, who? Schaeffer, where did that guy come from? And I think what people need to do is they need to return to this concept of understanding this line of despair and the way that ideas affect the way that we interpret issues in society. So in conclusion, what I want to do is I just really want us to see this idea of the ebb and flow of ideas. And in fact, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to make this a little bigger, and it'll allow you to see what's going on in the history of ideas. So bear with me as I pull this up here. So what I want you to see is that you've got different streams of thought that have come about. You've got this, there we go. You've got this notion of rationalism and empiricism, and rationalism and empiricism are both asking this question: what is the source of our knowledge? Does it come a priori or apart before experience, or is it a posteriori? Does it come from experience? And rationalist thinkers would have been figures like Descartes, Spinoza, Leibniz. Empiricists would be Locke, Berkeley, Hume. But what we find is that in Kant, he is in many respects the synthesis of the two different streams of thought. So the issue that we're trying to talk about is what is the content and origin of our knowledge? And Kant would say, well, reality doesn't come purely from this a priori concept or purely from this a posteriori. They come from both. So what he's going to give is he's going to give us this notion of a synthetic a priori. And let me break that down. You've got two types of propositions: analytic propositions and synthetic propositions. And an analytic proposition is where the predicate is contained in the subject. So, for example, all bachelors are unmarried men. To be a bachelor is to be an unmarried man. So the predicate of unmarried man is by definition a bachelor, and a bachelor is by definition an unmarried man. Whereas the synthetic statement would be something like this: all bachelors are unmarried men who wear red shirts. Now we know there is nothing rationally entailed in the concept of being a bachelor or an unmarried man that requires you to wear a red shirt or a blue shirt or any shirt for that matter. And that's because the predicate is not contained in the subject. The predicate gives us new knowledge about the world in which we live. So think about it in this sense. Traditionally, many rationalists affirmed analytic types of statements. Many empiricists affirmed synthetic statements. And for a rationalist, you would have analytic a priori. For empiricists, you would have synthetic a posteriori. And here's what Kant tries to do. He tries to give us synthetic, so something that's telling us about the real world, that's a priori. So the categories of the mind somehow merge with the world in which we live, and that gives us this fusion of knowledge. This is the mind forms with the sense content, but you don't ever actually know reality in and of itself. You only know the way that it appears unto you. And the analogy that I give is like this. I'm giving an analogy as someone who grew up in the upper Midwest, and we got a lot of snow. And when you're driving at night and it's snowing, you're going down in the car and you've got the lights on, and whatever the lights are shining on when it's snowing, you can see the snow. It's uncategorized. We know that there's something beyond the light, but we don't know it directly. But whatever's in the light, it seems to give it coherent concepts that come together with it. It brings, in many ways, structure to it. And this is exactly what Kant claims is going on with the categories of the mind. Reality in and of itself is not structured until the mind structures it. So you don't know reality. You only know as it appears unto you. But the ebb and flow, as we pull this up here, is you see two main branches of concepts coming from Kant. You've got idealism and positivism. So idealism, reality is based on the notion of the mind, where it's an idea and it's radically subjective, and you're going to get Fichte, Schelling, Hegel, Nietzsche. And this is in many ways the philosophical precursors of existentialism, phenomenology, deconstructionism, and the like. But the other side of it is positivism. And this is where you're going to get logical positivism, linguistic analysis, and radical pragmatism. So what I want you to see is that each of them are birthed in some kind of concept that reality is not directly known. And the consequences of these ideas have real effects upon our theology. And that's why Schaeffer gave us this notion. It starts with a line of despair. Ideas have consequences that affect art, music, culture, and theology. There are, in many ways, as he said, secular implications of it, Kant to Hegel to Kierkegaard, but there are also theological consequences of it. Kierkegaard, who many would put within the broader Christian movement, was a significant influence on Barth and Brunner and these figures upon the new hermeneutic. And I would even say the concept of hermeneutics within evangelicalism, specifically the whole woke movement today, find their precursors in these ideas. So what I want you to get from this video is that I want you to return to the concept of thinking in worldviews and philosophical thinking and the reality of what they do in our society. Equip yourself. Be prepared to think about these things because they're going to affect not only the highest universities of the land, but they're going to affect my house and your house and the White House and your kitchen table and the way that you're going to raise your kids and the way that you're going to disciple the people within your church. Don't go into this world unprepared. Work diligently on a regular basis because ideas have consequences. Not only do they have consequences, they have origins. And if you understand the origins and the teachings of the ideas, if you can understand the real effects of these ideas, you'll be equipped as a Christian to live in a post-Christian world.